The day Susan Donnelly arrived in Cutter's Creek, Texas, the sky was the color of a bruise and the wind carried the smell of rain that never came. She stepped off the stagecoach with nothing but a battered leather trunk, a pair of steady green eyes, and the kind of quiet determination that made men either step aside or stare. Most of them stared. It was the spring of 1873, and Cutter's Creek was the sort of town that chewed up soft things and spat them out before breakfast. Susan Donnelly was not a soft thing, though she had learned long ago that it helped to let people believe otherwise. She had come from Missouri, from a farm outside of Springfield that had belonged to her father, until the drought took the crops and the bank took the rest. Her mother had passed 3 winters prior, and her father, God rest his stubborn soul, had followed her not 6 months after, leaving Susan with $42, a mule that turned out to be borrowed, and a letter of introduction to a man named Gerald Hawthorne who ran the general store in Cutter's Creek and had, according to a distant cousin, been looking for a reliable shop hand. Gerald Hawthorne turned out to be 63 years old, half-deaf, and deeply suspicious of women who could read, but he hired Susan on a Thursday and put her to work that very afternoon stacking crates of dried beans and cataloging bolts of calico. The pay was modest, the room above the store was drafty, and the work was honest. Susan told herself that was enough. It was not enough, but she was good at telling herself things. Cutter's Creek itself was a town of about 400 souls pressed together along a single wide main street that turned to mud when it rained, and to dust when it did not. There was Hawthorne's general store, a livery stable run by a thick-armed man named Cord, a barbershop that also served as the town dentist, a church that held services every Sunday and card games every Saturday, a saloon called the Red Ace, and the sheriff's office, which had been empty for going on 2 months since Sheriff Pat Durning had taken a horse kick to the ribs and retired to his daughter's farm outside of Laredo. The absence of a sheriff was a wound the town had not yet figured out how to dress. There had been talk of sending for someone, but the town council, which consisted of Gerald Hawthorne, a land speculator named Otis Crane, and a cattle rancher named Bo Pickett who owned half the grazing land within 20 miles, could not agree on who should pay for it or who should have the authority to select the man. In the meantime, a loosely organized group of ranchers and townsmen kept a rough sort of order, and mostly it held. Mostly. Susan had been in Cutter's Creek for 9 days when she first saw Frank Wells. She was sweeping the front steps of the store on a Tuesday morning, the air already warm and smelling of horse and sun-baked wood, when a rider came down the main street at an unhurried pace on a bay horse that moved like it had all the time in the world. The rider was tall even in the saddle, lean in the way that comes from hard work rather than hunger, with dark hair that curled just slightly at the collar, and a face that had been weathered into something almost handsome by years of sun and wind. He wore a plain brown coat and a hat that had seen better decades, and he had the kind of eyes, dark and careful, that seemed to be looking at everything and reacting to nothing. He stopped at the water trough in front of the livery and let his horse drink. Susan went back to sweeping, or she tried to. She found herself watching the way he moved when he swung down from the saddle, easy and unhurried, the way he spoke quietly to the horse while it drank, the way he pushed the hat back on his head and squinted up the street as though he were reading it. Old Gerald came out behind her and made a sound like a satisfied cat. "That be Frank Wells," Gerald said, louder than necessary because he was hard of hearing and assumed everyone else was too. "Drifted through here about 2 years back, stayed on at the Pickett Ranch. Best hand Bo Pickett's ever had by all accounts." "Is that so?" Susan said, which was not really a question. "Good man," Gerald added. "Quiet, doesn't drink more than he should, doesn't gamble more than he can afford, doesn't cause trouble." He paused. "Doesn't much talk to people either." "A man of many virtues," Susan said dryly and went back to sweeping. But that evening, when she sat in her drafty little room above the store with the window open to catch what breeze there was, and tried to read the 3-month-old newspaper she had found in the bottom of a crate. She found her mind drifting, and it drifted, with an irritating lack of direction, toward dark, careful eyes and a horse that moved like it had all the time in the world. She put the paper down and told herself firmly that she had not come to Texas to be foolish. She was, in fact, very good at being foolish when she put her mind to it. The second time she saw Frank Wells, it was not a gentle encounter. It was 10 days after the first, on a Friday afternoon, when the street was crowded with ranch hands coming in for their week's end, and the Red Ace was already doing a brisk business. Susan was crossing the street with a wrapped package of letters she was taking to the post office for Gerald when 3 men spilled out of the saloon in a cloud of laughter and whiskey, one of them stumbling directly into her path and sending her letters scattering across the dust. The man who had knocked into her was young and red-faced and found the whole thing extremely funny. His 2 companions did also. Susan crouched down and began gathering the letters with a controlled patience that was costing her more than it looked. "Pardon me, miss, I think one of those blew under the boardwalk," said one of the companions, not helpfully, as he pointed at a letter that was now 6 inches under the raised wooden walk and covered in dust. "I can see that, thank you," Susan said evenly. She was about to decide whether to leave it or press her dress into the dirt to retrieve it when a pair of worn brown boots appeared beside her, and a hand she did not recognize reached under the boardwalk and retrieved the letter without ceremony. She looked up. Frank Wells crouched beside her, holding the letter out with a directness that had no performance in it. "Thank you," she said. "You're the new woman at Hawthorne's store," he said. It was not unfriendly, just straightforward, as though he were confirming a fact he already knew and had been somewhat uncertain whether to do anything with. "Susan Donnelly," she said, standing and taking the letter. Frank Wells, he stood as well. He was taller than she had gauged from the first distance, and the eyes were the same, careful and dark, but up close there was something else in them that she could not immediately name. A kind of steadiness, she decided. The kind that was not indifference but something older and more considered than indifference. "I know," she said. "Gerald told me." Something that might have been amusement moved across his face so briefly she almost missed it. "Gerald tells everyone everything," he said. "That is his great gift," she agreed. The 3 cowboys had drifted on down the street, the incident already forgotten to them. Frank Wells glanced after them, then back at her, and there was a brief moment where neither of them said anything, and the silence was neither awkward nor entirely comfortable, but something in between that Susan filed away in the part of her mind she used for things she intended to think about later. "Safe walk, Miss Donnelly," he said, touching the brim of his hat, and walked on. She watched him go for exactly 3 seconds before she made herself look away and continue toward the post office. 3 seconds, she decided, was reasonable. Less would have been rude. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm. Susan learned the store, learned the town, learned which customers required patience and which required simple efficiency. She learned that Otis Crane, the speculator, had recently purchased the deed to 3 farms east of town under circumstances that several people found troubling but nobody had yet done anything about. She learned that Bo Pickett, for all his land and money, was considered a fair employer if a demanding one. She learned that the woman who ran the church sewing circle, a formidable widow named Clara Marsh, was the actual center of gravity around which all information in Cutter's Creek orbited, and that getting on Clara's good side was both a social necessity and a genuine pleasure because Clara was sharp and funny and had no patience for pretense. She also learned, by degrees, more about Frank Wells. He came into the store perhaps once a week, sometimes more when the ranch needed supplies. He was economical with words in a way that would have felt cold from another person, but from him felt simply honest, as though he thought words should mean something and declined to produce them when they didn't. He always said please and thank you, always paid exactly what was owed, occasionally asked a question about the stock with the focused interest of someone who actually cared about quality. And once, when Gerald dropped an entire box of glass lamp chimneys, appeared from nowhere to catch two of them before they hit the floor, and spent 20 minutes helping Susan sweep up the rest without being asked. Gerald watched all of this with the expression of a man who found it secretly delightful and was doing a poor job of hiding it. "Frank Wells doesn't help anyone sweep up broken glass," Gerald told Susan that evening while she was closing the shutters. "Well," Susan said, "he helped me." Gerald made the satisfied cat sound again and went upstairs. It was Clara Marsh who told Susan the fuller story of Frank Wells. On a warm May afternoon, when Susan had been invited to the sewing circle, which she quickly realized was less a sewing circle and more a town council that actually functioned. Frank Wells had come to Cutter's Creek 2 years back from somewhere in New Mexico, or possibly Colorado. Accounts differed. He had worked the picket ranch with a competence that was immediately apparent, and an authority he never seemed to seek but which settled around him anyway, so that within 6 months the other hands were deferring to him in the field without anyone having formalized the arrangement. He was 28 years old, Clara said, and had been, before he came to Texas, briefly a deputy in a small town in the New Mexico territory whose name Clara could not recall, a career that had ended when the sheriff he served under turned out to be taking money from the wrong men, and Frank Wells, being the kind of man he was, had found himself on the wrong side of a bad situation through no fault of his own. "He doesn't talk about it," Clara said, threading a needle with the assurance of long practice. "But you can see it on him if you look. He is a man who had something taken from him, a reputation, a certainty about the world, something like that, and decided the answer was to be very quiet and very good at what he did and wait." "Wait for what?" Susan asked. Clara looked at her over the rims of her spectacles with a particular expression. "That," she said, "I suspect he is still working out." Susan went home that evening and was honest with herself for perhaps 10 minutes, which was long enough to admit that she thought about Frank Wells more than was warranted by the number and nature of their interactions, and that this was, at this point, simply a fact she was going to have to live with. It was in June that things in Cutter's Creek began to tighten. Otis Crane had been buying up land deeds quietly for over a year, and the pattern of what he was doing was becoming clearer to anyone paying attention. He was assembling a corridor of land that would control access to the creek that gave the town its name, the only reliable water source in a 30-mile radius. If he completed that corridor, he could charge what he liked for water rights, to the ranchers, to the farmers, to the town itself. Several families had already sold to him under pressure that stopped just short of what you could take to a court, assuming there had been a court nearby to take anything to. One farm family, the Garcias, had held out, and had subsequently found their fences cut and their well contaminated with lye, which everyone in town knew was Crane's doing, and for which there was, in the absence of a sheriff, no formal recourse. It was the situation with the Garcias that finally forced the town council into action regarding the sheriff's vacancy, and it was at this meeting, held in the back room of the Red Ace on a Thursday evening, that Susan first saw Frank Wells in a context beyond the store and the street. She was there because Clara Marsh had brought her, on the grounds that Susan had a sharp mind, and the meeting needed at least one more person with a sharp mind. Bo Pickett occupied one end of the table, broad and red-faced and uncomfortable in the way of a man who knows the right thing and is calculating the cost. Otis Crane sat at the other end, smooth and watchful in a black coat that was too fine for the room. Gerald Hawthorne sat in the middle and looked confused, which he often did and had learned to use to his advantage. Frank Wells stood along the wall, arms folded, not invited exactly but present by some unspoken agreement that his opinion on practical matters was worth having. The meeting went in circles for 20 minutes. Crane argued that the vacancy was a matter for the county to resolve, and that in the meantime private enterprise, by which he meant his own operations, should not be impeded. Pickett argued that someone should be deputized locally. Gerald argued that they needed to send for someone with proper credentials. Clara Marsh sat in the corner with her hands folded and did not say anything for a while, which was, Susan had learned, how Clara operated before she said the thing that actually mattered. It was Clara who finally said, "The question is not where we find a sheriff. The question is what kind of sheriff we find. We need someone who will not be bought." The room went quiet in a way that was pointed. Crane shifted slightly. Pickett looked at the table. Susan found herself looking at Frank Wells. He was looking at the floor, jaw set, and she could see on his face the particular expression she recognized from Clara's description, the expression of a man who had already thought through the implications and found them uncomfortable and was deciding how to respond to them. It was after the meeting, on the steps of the Red Ace in the warm evening air, that Susan ended up standing near him while the others dispersed in their various directions. "You know what they're all circling around," she said. It was not an accusation, just an observation. He glanced at her, the careful eyes. "I know," he said. "Would you do it?" He was quiet for a moment. A horse moved somewhere in the livery. The saloon noise drifted out through the walls. "I had a badge once," he said. "It didn't end well." "From what I understand," Susan said, measuring her words, "that was because of someone else's choices, not yours." He looked at her more fully then, and she held it, and for a moment the whole busy business of Cutter's Creek simply paused around them. "You've been asking about me," he said, not offended, just noting it. "Clara Marsh tells everyone everything," Susan said. "That is her great gift." The corner of his mouth moved, and this time she was close enough and paying enough attention to confirm that it was, definitively, a smile. "I'll think about it," he said, and touched his hat and walked into the evening. He did think about it. He thought about it for 10 days, during which time Otis Crane had 2 more quiet conversations with families on the Water Corridor land, and the Garcias found a second fence cut. The town was holding its breath in the way of places that have been waiting for something to happen, and are beginning to suspect the waiting is about to end. On the 11th day, Frank Wells walked into the sheriff's office, which had been sitting empty and unlocked, sat down behind the desk, and asked the town council to make it official. The council did so with a speed that suggested relief. Clara Marsh baked a pie and left it on the desk. Susan heard about the appointment from Gerald before noon and stood behind the store counter feeling something warm move through her chest that she resisted identifying too specifically. The first thing Frank did as sheriff was ride out to the Garcia farm. The Garcia family, Eduardo and Maria and their 2 teenage sons, had been in Cutter's Creek longer than the town's current name. Their land was good land, creek-fed and well-worked, and Eduardo Garcia was a man of enormous dignity who had been enduring the pressure from Crane with a patient fury that was close to its limit. Frank rode out alone on a Monday, spent 2 hours talking with Eduardo on the front porch, and came back to town with a written statement about the fence cutting and the well signed and witnessed. It was not, by itself, enough to do anything legally with, but it was a record. It was the beginning of something. Susan heard about this from Clara and from Gerald, and from the various customers who filtered through the store in the following days, because the town was watching Frank Wells the way you watch a match being struck near dry kindling, with a mixture of hope and apprehension. She saw him herself that Wednesday. He came into the store for lamp oil and a new set of gloves, and he was wearing the badge, a plain 5-pointed star pinned to his coat, and something about seeing it there on him, plain and unornamented, made her feel things she was not going to examine publicly. "The Garcia situation," she said, because she could not help herself. "Working on it," he said, examining a pair of work gloves. "Crane is not going to sit quietly." "No," he agreed, "he is not." "Is there something the rest of us can do?" He looked up from the gloves. "The rest of you," he said, and there was something in his voice she had not heard before, a kind of warmth tucked under the practical surface of it. "The town," she said, "people who want this resolved. Document what you see," he said. "Dates, times, what happened. If you hear something that seems like it matters, tell me." He paused, And don't let Crane buy a single bolt of cloth on credit." She stared at him. He held her gaze with a steadiness that was almost laughing, and she understood that this last part was his form of humor, dry and delivered without fanfare. "I can absolutely manage that," she said. He paid for the lamp oil and the gloves and left, and Gerald, who had been pretending to catalog flour sacks in the back and had heard every word, came to the doorway and said, "You know, Susan, I don't think I've ever seen Frank Wells talk that much at one time." "Gerald," Susan said, "if you say another word I will personally rearrange every tin of peaches in this store in a way you will not recover from." Gerald went back to his flour sacks. The summer deepened and the heat pressed down on Cutter's Creek with the kind of weight that made the days slow and the evenings precious. Susan had settled into the town by now in a way that surprised her, given that she had never intended to put down roots here, had thought of it as a stopping place, a rebuilding place. But she knew Clara's laugh and Eduardo Garcia's careful handshake, and the names of the horses at Cord's livery, and the sound the wind made coming off the plains at dusk, and these things had attached themselves to her without asking permission. She and Frank Wells developed, over those summer weeks, a habit of talking. It began practically, the way he said it would with her passing him information, a comment Crane had made in the store that seemed designed to be overheard. The fact that one of Crane's hired men had been asking questions about the Garcia deed at the land office. But it expanded, quietly and without either of them forcing it, into something that had less to do with Crane and more to do with them. He would stop by the store in the evenings sometimes, after the day's work, and lean against the counter while she finished closing up, and they would talk. About the town at first, then about other things. She told him about Missouri, about the farm, about her father's stubbornness and her mother's warmth, and the particular grief of watching a place you grew up in come apart at the seams. He listened the way he did everything else, fully and without interruption, and when he spoke in response, it was with a quality of attention that made her feel both seen and steady. He told her, in pieces and over multiple evenings, about New Mexico. About the sheriff who had taken him on as deputy in a town called Roja Blanca, a good position, a good start, and about the slow revelation that the sheriff was allowing a cattle operation to use town land illegally in exchange for payment, and about Frank's attempt to do something about it, which had resulted in him being let go, his testimony ignored by a county judge who had his own arrangements with the same cattle operation, and his reputation in that territory effectively ended. "I should have seen it sooner," he said one evening. He was sitting on the edge of the porch railing outside the store, the sky going orange and pink over the plains, and Susan was sitting in the chair Gerald kept outside that nobody ever used except her. "You were trusting someone you had reason to trust," she said. "A lawman can't afford that kind of trust without verification. A person can't live without that kind of trust," she said. "You can't verify everyone before you extend good faith. You'd be paralyzed." He looked at her. The sunset was doing something remarkable behind him, and she was doing her absolute best to focus on the conversation. "That is," he said slowly, "a more generous interpretation than I've been giving myself." "Have found," Susan said, "that we are generally the least generous interpreters of our own situations." He was quiet for a moment. The evening air moved between them. "Susan," he said, and then stopped. "Yes, I'm glad you came to Cutter's Creek," he said. It was simple and direct and carried in its plainness more weight than an elaborate speech would have. She held it for a moment, feeling the warmth of it settle somewhere deep. "So am I," she said. "I wasn't for the first week, but I am now." He smiled at that, a real one, fuller than the corner-of-the-mouth version she had been cataloging, and she filed it away in a different part of her mind entirely. It was July when Otis Crane made his significant move. He did not cut a fence or contaminate a well. He hired a lawyer from San Antonio, a man named Harlow who arrived with a briefcase and a self-assurance that felt like a weather front. and Harlow filed a claim at the county seat asserting that the Garcia property deed contained a surveying error that predated the family's ownership, and that the creekfront portion of the land was therefore improperly registered and should revert to public land, at which point Crane had already filed a preemptive purchase claim. It was legal maneuvering of a quality that Cutter's Creek had not seen, and it was effective in a way that brute pressure had not been, because it moved the conflict from the physical realm, where Frank's badge meant something, to the legal realm, where it meant considerably less. Frank came to the store the afternoon he got the news from the county seat, and he sat on the edge of the counter and was quiet for a long moment while Susan closed the store around the two of them. "He's smart," Frank said. "I'll give him that." "There has to be something wrong with the claim," Susan said. "The Garcias have been on that land for 20 years. There must be documentation." Eduardo says his father's original deed is in Spanish from when this was still Mexican territory. Whether the county court is going to give that its proper weight is another question. "Then we need someone who can give it proper weight," Susan said. "A lawyer of our own." With what money? Susan thought about this. It was a real question. The Garcias were land-rich and cash-poor. Frank's sheriff's salary was modest. The town had no formal fund for legal expenses. "Clara Marsh," Susan said. Frank looked at her. "Clara Marsh," she repeated, "knows everyone in this county and half the state. She had a brother who was a judge in San Antonio before he died. She has connections to people with resources and with principles. If we explain the situation, if we go to her properly and lay it out, she may know who to call." Frank considered this with the focused attention he brought to everything. "All right," he said. "We'll go to Clara." She noticed, without pointing it out, that he had said we. Clara listened to the full situation the following morning in her kitchen over coffee, asked 4 precise questions, and by noon had written 3 letters. One to a lawyer in Austin who had made a career of property rights cases involving land originally deeded under Mexican rule. One to a judge she knew in the county seat who owed her a favor she had been saving. And one to a woman in San Antonio whose name Clara declined to share but whose influence, she indicated, was more extensive than her social position suggested. "This is going to take time," Clara told them. "The law is slow, but the claim is weak if you have the right person examining it. Eduardo's original deed, the Spanish-language one, has legal weight under the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. Crane's lawyer knows this and is hoping the county court won't bother to check." "How long?" Frank asked. 3 weeks, possibly 4, before we hear from Austin. "Can we keep Crane from acting in the meantime?" Clara looked at Frank over her spectacles. "That," she said, "is your department, Sheriff." Frank kept Crane from acting through a combination of methodical attention and the kind of quiet presence that makes certain men recalculate their risks. He increased his visible patrols around the Garcia property. He had careful conversations with Crane's hired men that left them with the clear impression that any move against the Garcias would be documented and prosecuted to whatever extent the law allowed. He did not threaten. He did not bluster. He simply made it clear, through the consistency of his presence and the steadiness of his regard, that the cost of action had risen. During those weeks, Susan did something she had not planned. She organized. It began with a conversation with Clara, and then a wider conversation at the sewing circle, which functioned, as she had observed, as a more effective governing body than the official council. By the end of it, Susan had quietly collected, from 10 different families in Cutter's Creek and the surrounding farms, a pool of money sufficient to cover initial legal costs, and had written a formal statement of community support for the Garcia family's land claim, signed by 37 people, which Frank filed at the county seat as a supplementary document to Eduardo's records. Frank found out about it when he saw the signed statement in the county paperwork. He came to the store that evening. It was late, the store closed, the street quiet, the sky full of stars in the way Texas skies are full of stars, completely and without reserve. "The community statement," he said, standing at the bottom of the porch steps. "People wanted to help," Susan said from her chair. "I just organized the wanting." He climbed the steps and stood looking at her for a moment. The starlight was enough to see his expression, and his expression was something she had not seen on him before. Open, she thought, just briefly, thoroughly open. "You know what you are," he said. "Someone who was very good at organizing church fundraisers in Missouri," she said lightly, because the openness in his face was doing things to her composure, and she needed a moment. "You are," he said, as though she had not spoken, "the most remarkable person I have met in a long time, Susan Donnelly." The quiet between them was different from previous quiets. It had a charge to it, the kind that precedes weather. "Frank," she said, because she had also been honest with herself enough to know this needed to be said, "I didn't come to Texas looking for anything except to rebuild what I'd lost. I didn't expect Cutter's Creek to matter to me. I didn't expect any of this." "No," he said softly, "I didn't either. But it does matter," she said. "You matter." She paused. "I'm not saying that lightly." He came and crouched down so he was level with her, his forearms on his knees, close enough that she could see all of his face clearly. "Neither am I," he said. She reached out and put her hand over his, and they stayed like that for a moment under the Texas stars, not kissing, not declaring anything more elaborate, just being together in the fullness of what they had both just admitted, which was more than enough for the moment. Later, she would think that this was the real beginning, not the first sighting or the letter in the dust or the evening conversations, but this, the stars and the porch steps and the honesty. The letter from Austin arrived 3 weeks later on a Wednesday, and it was everything Clara had hoped. The lawyer, a man named Peter Caldwell who had built a considerable career on exactly this kind of case, had examined the documentation and found it solid. The Garcia family's original deed, issued under Mexican law in 1849 and legally continuous under the treaty terms, was valid and properly recorded. Crane's surveying error claim was, in Caldwell's precise legal language, without factual or legal merit, and would be dismissed by any court that examined the relevant documentation and applicable federal law. Caldwell had also, through channels Susan did not entirely understand, but Clara seemed to find entirely normal, arranged for the county judge to receive a formal briefing from the Texas State Land Office before the case was heard, which effectively ensured that the hearing would proceed with accurate information rather than with Crane's preferred version of it. Frank delivered the news to Eduardo and Maria Garcia on a Thursday morning, riding out early before the heat came up, and Susan went with him because she wanted to see Eduardo's face when he heard it. Eduardo Garcia stood on his porch and listened to Frank explain the legal situation in clear and careful English, and when it was done he was quiet for a moment and then he said, in the particular Spanish-inflected English that was his own, "You tell me this is finished. My family keeps this land. The case will be formally heard in 3 weeks," Frank said. "But based on what Caldwell has told us, yes, your family keeps this land." Eduardo Garcia, a man of enormous dignity who had been holding himself rigid against the pressure for over a year, sat down on the porch steps and put his face in his hands. Not weeping exactly, but releasing something that had been held so long and so tightly that its release needed a moment of privacy, or at least of stillness. Maria Garcia came out of the house and stood beside him and put her hand on his shoulder, and Susan felt her throat tighten in a way she did not bother to suppress. The case was formally heard and dismissed 4 weeks later. Otis Crane's lawyer appealed, which delayed things by another month, but the appeal was resolved in the Garcias' favor with an efficiency that bore Clara Marsh's invisible fingerprints. Crane himself left Cutter's Creek 3 days after the appeal was resolved. He packed his things quietly and took the morning stage, and nobody saw him off except the station master. The town watched him go with the collective exhale of a place that has been holding its breath. It was September by then, the heat easing its grip on the plains, the mornings carrying a cool edge that felt like a promise. Susan and Frank had been in something that neither of them had formally named, which was partly because they were both careful people and partly because the crane situation had filled most of the available space, and partly because some things do not require naming in order to exist. But names have their value. It was a Saturday evening, the kind that Cutter's Creek did best, the Red Ace full and the church social wrapping up and the whole town in motion. And Susan and Frank walked along the edge of town where the last buildings gave way to open land, because they had both discovered that they preferred the edges of things to the centers. "I keep thinking about Missouri," Susan said, not with sadness, just as a fact. "What about it? Whether I could have saved the farm if I'd been smarter, if I'd done something differently." She paused. "I've been here long enough now that I know the answer is probably no. The drought was the drought. The bank was the bank, but you still turn it over." "Yes," he said, "you do. Is that what you do with New Mexico?" He walked a few steps in silence. The stars were appearing one by one and then all at once the way they did here. "Less than I used to," he said, "partly because enough time has passed, partly because," he stopped. Because I found something here that makes the past feel less like a debt," he said. She stopped walking. He stopped a step after her and turned back. "Frank," she said, "I need you to say what you mean. I am not a person who does well with things left half said." "I know that about you," he said, and there was warmth in it. "All right." He came back the step. They were standing close in the rising dark. "I am in love with you, Susan. I have been for a while, and I think you know it, and I also think you feel the same way, and I have been waiting because I wanted to be sure the timing was right, and I now think the timing is as right as it is going to get." She looked at him for a moment. The stars were fully out. Somewhere behind them, Cutter's Creek made its small, warm noises. "Yes," she said. "The timing is right." She put her hand against his face. "And yes, I feel the same way. I have been in love with you since somewhere around the time you helped sweep up the broken lamp chimneys. And if you tell Gerald, I will deny it absolutely." He laughed, a full, real laugh that she had not heard from him before, and that was, as it turned out, one of the finest sounds she had encountered. He put his hands on her waist, and she went up on her toes and kissed him, there on the edge of Cutter's Creek with the Texas night all around them, and it was as straightforward and as enormous as everything else about him. Gerald Hawthorne, as it turned out, already knew. Gerald told Susan the next morning that he had known since the broken lamp chimneys, which he had possibly not dropped entirely by accident, a claim Susan found suspicious and Gerald found delightful. The autumn moved through Cutter's Creek with the particular beauty of Texas falls, the light going golden and the air becoming something you wanted to stay in. Susan and Frank moved through it together, and the town, which had been watching and hoping with the thoroughness of a community that had run out of other entertainment, was pleased. Clara Marsh told anyone who would listen that she had seen it coming from the second week. Eduardo Garcia sent a basket of vegetables to the store with a note that said, in Maria's handwriting, "For the woman who helped save our home, with gratitude and good wishes." Gerald raised Susan's pay without being asked, which she appreciated and did not draw attention to. Frank came to the store most evenings now, openly and without the slight self-consciousness of earlier months, and sometimes he brought supper from the boarding-house kitchen and they ate on the porch and talked about everything and nothing, the way people do when they have found someone they can be quiet with and be talking with in equal measure and find both equally satisfying. He told her more about his life before Roja Blanca. He had grown up in Kansas, on a cattle farm outside of Abilene, the second of 3 boys, his father a working man of few words and considerable skill with horses, his mother a practical woman who had taught all 3 of her sons to cook, and to read on the grounds that neither skill had ever made a man smaller. He had been a hand on various operations through his early 20s, a cattle drive from Texas to Kansas once, which had been the longest and most clarifying experience of his life, and then the deputy's position in New Mexico, and then Cutter's Creek. Susan told him about her own early life, the farm in the good years, her mother's garden and her father's enormous laugh, and the winter when the creek behind their property had frozen solid enough to skate on, which had been the most magical 2 weeks of her childhood. She told him about the school she had attended until she was 14, where the teacher, a young woman not much older than her students, had given Susan a particular love of books and mathematics. She told him about the slow decline of the farm, and the years of trying to hold it together, and the grief of finally admitting it was gone. He listened to all of it, and at the end he said quietly, "You have been holding a great deal by yourself for a long time." "I am good at holding things," she said. "I know," he said. "I would like, if you will allow it, to help hold some of them." It was the most romantic thing anyone had ever said to her, and it was expressed, characteristically, in the language of practical partnership rather than grand gesture, and she loved him for it completely. The formal proposal came on a November evening when the plains were frost-edged, and the inside of the store smelled of wood smoke and cinnamon from the candles Gerald had recently stocked. Frank came in at closing time, which was normal, and stood at the counter looking at something in his hand which was less normal. He set it on the counter between them. It was a ring, simple silver with a small turquoise stone, the kind of thing you found in the New Mexico territory, and she looked at it and then at him. "I picked this up when I left Roja Blanca," he said. "I don't know exactly why. I was not in a state at the time for optimism, but I carried it." He paused. "I think I carried it for this." She looked at the ring, she looked at him. "Susan Donnelly," he said, "I would like to spend the rest of my life talking with you on porches and solving problems with you, and disagreeing with you when I think you're wrong and being corrected by you when you're right, which will be most of the time. I would like to be your husband, if you will have me." "Yes," she said, which was the same word she had been saying to him in various contexts for months, and which remained entirely accurate. She picked up the ring herself and put it on, which seemed right, and he came around the counter and kissed her with the warmth of a man who has been waiting a very long time for something he did not entirely believe he was going to find. Gerald Hawthorne, who had again been in the back and heard everything, began making the satisfied cat sound and did not stop for several days. They were married in December, in the Cutters Creek Church on a clear, cold morning, by a minister who had ridden in from the county seat for the occasion. Clara Marsh had organized the flowers, which were dried and beautiful. Eduardo and Maria Garcia sat in the second row, and Maria cried with the unashamed generosity of someone who feels that this occasion has earned it. The Pickett Ranch hands, who had known Frank for 2 years and regarded him with a combination of loyalty and affectionate exasperation, occupied most of the left side of the church and were loudly well-behaved. Susan wore her best dress, which was green and brought out her eyes, and Frank wore a new coat that Clara had quietly arranged for him, and when they stood at the front of the church and faced each other, the room went very still with the collective held breath of 40 people who had been hoping for this. "I, Frank Wells," he said, in the direct voice she had learned to love, "take you, Susan Donnelly, to be my wife. To stay with you and work alongside you and love you for all the days I have. I, Susan Donnelly," she said, and her voice was clear and steady, "take you, Frank Wells, to be my husband. To stay with you and challenge you and love you for all the days I have." The minister pronounced them married, and Frank kissed her, and the church made a collective sound that was somewhere between applause and relieved laughter, and Clara Marsh, who was not a sentimental woman, was observed to be blinking somewhat rapidly. They had a small celebration in the church hall afterward, with the town's best cooking spread across 2 long tables, and the Red Aces fiddle player brought over to provide music, and Susan danced with Frank in the candle-lit hall, surrounded by the people who had become, over the course of 1 improbable year, her community, and felt something settle in her that she recognized as happiness, real happiness, the settled kind that does not require you to hold your breath. Frank was still the sheriff, and would remain so for the foreseeable future, the town having discovered that a good sheriff was a thing worth keeping. Susan remained at Hawthorne's store, which suited her, and over the winter she and Gerald had a series of conversations that resulted, by February, in an arrangement whereby Susan became a genuine partner in the business. her name on the books alongside Gerald's, with a share of the profits in exchange for her doing the work she had already been doing more thoroughly and better than Gerald had managed alone. Gerald, in making this arrangement, said only, "I should have done it in September," which was the closest he ever came to admitting he had been slow. The winter was cold and quiet and good. They had found a small house at the western edge of town, 2 rooms and a porch and a wood stove that heated the whole thing into something close and warm, and Susan made it into a home with the same practical thoroughness she brought to everything. Frank built shelves. She filled them with books she ordered through the store, which was a luxury she refused to apologize for. He surprised her with a kitchen garden plot when the ground thawed in March, fenced and ready, because she had mentioned, once, the garden her mother had kept in Missouri. "I remembered," he said simply when she found it. "You remember everything," she said, which was both observation and something much larger. Spring came again to Cutter's Creek, the second spring since Susan had stepped off the stagecoach with her trunk and her steady green eyes, and the town had changed in the year and some months between. The Crane situation was resolved and the water corridor intact, the Garcia land secure. The sheriff's office was occupied and functioning. The general store had a new sign that read Hawthorne and Donnelly Wells, which Susan had requested, and Gerald had implemented with a pride that surprised them both. Eduardo Garcia, who had become, over the course of the winter, something like a friend to both Susan and Frank, rode into town in April with news that he had negotiated an agreement with 3 neighboring farms to build a shared irrigation channel from the creek, a project that would stabilize all 4 properties against dry years, and which Frank had helped negotiate and Susan had helped document. It was at the celebration of the irrigation agreement's completion, on a warm May evening at the Garcia farm, where Maria had laid out a table that could have fed twice the assembled company, that Susan took Frank aside after supper and told him something she had known for about a week and had been turning over carefully, the way she turned over things she wanted to be sure of before she said them. "We're going to need another room in that house," she said. He was quiet for a moment and she watched him process it, and then his face did the thing she had seen it do on the porch steps with the stars, just for a moment completely open. "Susan," he said. "Yes," she said. "By November, I think." He took her hands in both of his with a gentleness that had always been there underneath the steadiness and the practicality, and she could see that he was, for once, not quite sure what to say, which she found endearing beyond expression. "Are you happy?" she asked. "I don't have a word for what I am," he said. "But yes, exceedingly yes." She laughed and put her head against his chest, and he held her there in the warm May evening while the Garcia farm made its cheerful sounds around them. The room was added by August. Frank and the Garcia boys and 2 of the picket hands built it over 3 weekends in the summer heat, Frank directing the work with the same focused competence he brought to everything, and Susan supplied the workers with cold water and opinions about the window placement, which Frank incorporated without argument, because her instincts about the house had been consistently better than his. On a Tuesday in early November, with the plains outside the window gone gold and dry, and the wood stove putting out its steady warmth, their son was born. Clara Marsh was present, as was the doctor who had come to Cutter's Creek in the summer, a young man from Baltimore named Dr. Aaron Pierce, who had arrived with a modern medical education and an immediate and deep disorientation in the face of the actual conditions of the frontier, which he had been adapting to with a genuine effort that Susan respected. Clara supervised everything with calm authority. Frank was in the next room and Susan could hear him, when she had a moment to listen, absolutely not pacing, which was the sound of a man who was definitely pacing and trying not to. When Clara carried the baby to the doorway and told Frank he could come in, Susan watched him cross the room and take the small bundled weight she held out, and she watched his face, which cycled through several things she knew well and several she had not seen before, and all of which were entirely right. "Hello," he said to the baby in his direct, quiet way, as though he were introducing himself to a person, which he was. "His name," Susan said from the bed, "is Thomas, after my father." Frank looked up at her. "Thomas," he said, and there was so much in the way he said it that she did not need anything else added. Thomas Wells turned out to be a very direct person from the first weeks of his life, which surprised no one who knew his parents. He had Frank's dark hair and, as he grew, Susan's green eyes, and he was, from the beginning, intensely interested in everything around him, grabbing at whatever was in reach, opinionated about his preferences, and apparently convinced that the entire world had been arranged for his investigation. Frank was, as a father, exactly as Susan would have predicted, attentive and steady, patient with exhaustion in a way that impressed her, and quietly delighted by the small person in a manner he expressed through action rather than declaration. He was the one who got up at 3 in the morning without complaint. He was the one who figured out that Thomas preferred to be walked rather than rocked. He was the one who, when Thomas was 4 months old and had discovered that faces were fascinating, would sit across from him and maintain an earnest mutual staring contest for remarkable lengths of time. Susan watched this and felt something that she had not had a name for until she had it, the particular fullness of seeing the people you love in relationship with each other. Clara Marsh, at Thomas's first Christmas, held him with the practiced ease of a woman who had delivered half the children in the county and said, "He looks like his father, but he's going to think like his mother, and that combination is going to make life interesting for everyone around him." "You say that like it's a warning," Frank said. "It is a warning," Clara said happily. The years in Cutter's Creek settled into something that was not simple, because life never is, but that was good, dependably and genuinely good, in a way that both Susan and Frank recognized and did not take for granted. Frank served as sheriff for 6 years before he passed the position to a young deputy he had trained himself, a man named James Corey, who had the same combination of steadiness and incorruptibility that had made Frank effective. Frank made the transition without regret, because he had done what needed doing, and the town was, by then, the kind of place that maintained its own order without requiring constant vigilance. He returned to ranching, in partnership with Eduardo Garcia, who had expanded his operation over the years and needed someone with Frank's knowledge of cattle and horses. The Garcia-Wells partnership, as it became known, was one of the more successful operations in the county within 3 years. Susan had, by the time Thomas was 2, become the effective manager of Hawthorne's store when Gerald's health declined enough that he stepped back from the daily work. Gerald lived 4 more years, comfortable in a back room of the building he had given most of his life to, and died in the spring when Thomas was 6, leaving the store entirely to Susan in his will, with a note that read, in Gerald's large, uneven handwriting, "I always knew you were more than a shop hand, and I was right." Susan cried over that note once privately, and then pinned it inside the stockroom door where she could see it. The store, under Susan's full management, became somewhat more than a store. She added a small lending library of books, a dozen volumes that grew to 40 within a year as she ordered carefully, and the town discovered that it wanted them. She established a regular supply arrangement with the Garcia farm and 2 others, so that the store stocked local produce alongside the dry goods and supplies, which benefited the farmers and gave the town fresher food. She hired a young Mexican-American woman named Rosa Delgado as her assistant, because Rosa had the same sharp mind and steady reliability that Susan recognized from her own early working years, and because it was, Susan felt, the right thing to do in a town that did not always make those things easy. Rosa's hiring was noted, and a few people noted it with something less than enthusiasm, and Susan dealt with this by being perfectly pleasant and entirely immovable, which was her method with most obstacles. "You are going to be, in about 10 years, running things in this county," Frank said one evening without particular alarm. "I am not interested in running things," Susan said. "I am interested in building things." "That is a distinction that may matter to you more than to anyone else," he said. She threw a dish towel at him and he caught it and folded it neatly, which was infuriating. Thomas grew into a boy of considerable energy, and a combination of his father's observational quality and his mother's directness that made him an interesting person to be around, and as Clara had predicted, somewhat exhausting for everyone attempting to answer his questions. He spent a great deal of time at the Garcia farm, where Eduardo's sons, now young men, took him under their wing with an easy, affectionate authority. He learned to ride with Frank's patient instruction and became, by the time he was 8, a genuinely capable horseman, small but fearless. When Thomas was 8.5, Susan told Frank that the house was going to need expanding again. Frank sat across from her at the kitchen table and did the same quiet processing as before and arrived at the same open expression. "Are you well?" he asked, which was always his first question. "I am very well," she said. "Though I would strongly appreciate it if this one arrives in a warmer month." "I will see what I can arrange," he said, which made her laugh. Their daughter arrived in May, which was the warmest month, almost as though she had taken the preference into account. She was born on a Tuesday morning in the same room as Thomas, with Dr. Pierce in attendance and Clara Marsh supervising with the authority of long experience. Frank was allowed in the room this time, which had been Susan's decision and Dr. Pierce's somewhat uncertain agreement, and he held her hand throughout with a steadiness that she needed, and he gave without reservation. Their daughter came into the world with a great deal of opinion about the process and made this opinion known loudly, and she was, at first sight, a person of considerable presence. She had Susan's red-gold hair, which nobody had anticipated, and Frank's dark eyes, and an expression even in her first days that suggested she was already finding things insufficiently organized. "What do we name her?" Frank asked, holding her in the crook of his arm with the familiar ease of a man who had done this before and retained all of it. "Eleanor," Susan said, "after no one in particular, but it is the right name." Frank looked at the baby. "Eleanor Wells," he said, and Eleanor responded by grabbing his finger with a completeness that he found apparently remarkable. Thomas was brought in to meet his sister and regarded her with the solemn attention of someone encountering a new variable and determining its implications. He looked at her for a long moment and then looked at his parents. "Is she always going to be this loud?" he asked. "Probably," Frank said. Thomas accepted this with the equanimity of a child raised by honest people and subsequently became an extremely good older brother, protective and patient and occasionally bossy, which Eleanor, as she grew, reciprocated entirely. Clara Marsh, holding Eleanor at the first Sunday after the birth, said, "This one is going to be something." "They are both something," Susan said. "Yes," Clara agreed. "But this one is something specific. I can't tell you what yet." Clara turned out to be right, but the something specific took years to become apparent, which is the nature of such things. Cutter's Creek had grown in the decades since Susan arrived with her trunk and her steady eyes. The population had expanded, a second general store had opened and failed, which Susan felt about with more complexity than was strictly professional. A school had been established and a proper schoolhouse built. The water situation, secured by the Garcia case and the irrigation projects that had followed it, had made the farming land around the creek more valuable and more worked, bringing in new families and new skills. The town had acquired a telegraph office in 1878 and a new stage line connection the following year, and it felt, to those who had been there long enough to see the change, like a place that had decided to become itself. Frank and Eduardo Garcia's partnership had grown into something genuinely substantial. They ran 400 head of cattle and maintained the best horse operation in the county, and Frank had acquired a reputation, across the broader region, as the man to consult if you had a difficult horse or a complicated land dispute. Two categories of problem he had discovered he was equally suited to resolving. Eduardo's sons worked the operation with them, and the partnership had an easiness about it, a mutual respect that was evident in everything from how they made decisions to how they sat across from each other at the table on the evenings when the Garcias came for supper, or the Wells family went to the Garcia farm, which was most weeks. Maria Garcia and Susan had become the kind of friends who can be in comfortable silence with each other, which is the deepest kind. They worked together on the school board from its founding, and on the committee that argued successfully for a proper bridge over the creek rather than the ford that had been drowning horses since the town was established. They disagreed sometimes because they were both people of strong opinions, but they disagreed without damage, which is another mark of a genuine friendship. In 1879, 6 years after Susan had stepped off the stagecoach, the county held elections for a new county commissioner. Several names were put forward at the public meeting. Susan's was among them, put there by Clara Marsh with a formality that suggested considerable prior planning. Susan was surprised, which surprised Frank, who had been expecting this. "I told you," he said. "You told me I might eventually run things," she said. "I told you I was not interested in running things." "And yet," he said, with a patience that carried, as it always did, the very slight amusement underneath. "She ran for county commissioner and won by a margin that was both comfortable and, in the context of the county's history, historic, being the first woman elected to the office. She was 31 years old." The local newspaper, which had been established in 1877, ran a story that was cautiously positive, and which Susan read once and then used to wrap fish, which she told Frank made her feel she had responded proportionally. The commissioner's role was what she made of it, which was to say it was about building things. She worked on road improvements that opened the western part of the county to reliable trade. She established a formal process for resolving land disputes that incorporated both English and Spanish documentation, which addressed a gap that had been the source of the Garcia situation, and a dozen others like it. She pushed, over 4 years of determined effort, for the county to establish formal schools in 3 additional communities that had been operating informal instruction in barns and homes. Frank watched all of this with the same steadiness he had always offered her, the steady presence that was not passive but was the kind of active support that does not need constant declaration. He ran the ranch operation, raised their children, kept the house, and once, when Susan came home from a commissioner's meeting at 11 at night after a session that had required 6 hours and every gram of her political skill, had supper waiting and said nothing except, "Sit down, I'll bring it over." "I love you," she said, sitting down. "I know," he said, putting a plate in front of her. "Eat." Thomas, at 12, was a person of considerable seriousness mixed with a dry humor that his parents recognized as genetic. He was the best reader in his school and the best writer in his age group, and had, in the past year, developed a passion for the mechanical side of things, taking apart and successfully reassembling the store's adding machine, which was a new acquisition, with a focus that Dr. Pierce, who had become a family friend, described as diagnostic. Alina, at 3 and then 4, was confirming Clara's prediction in ways that were increasingly specific. She was, even at this young age, a social genius, the child who could walk into any gathering and within 10 minutes be the center of it, not through loudness but through a combination of absolute attention and what could only be described as charm that she had not learned from either parent. She had Frank's calm and Susan's directness, and something else entirely that seemed to be entirely her own, an instinct for people that was almost uncanny. "Where does that come from?" Frank asked once, watching Alina manage the social dynamics of a birthday gathering at the Garcia farm with an effectiveness that was slightly alarming in a 4-year-old. "I have no idea," Susan said. "But Clara called it 6 years ago. Clara calls everything. Clara is never wrong." He could not argue with this. Clara Marsh herself, now in her early 70s, remained the gravitational center of Cutter's Creek with undiminished force. She had slowed physically but not in any other regard, and her kitchen table remained the most important gathering place in the town, the place where difficult things were worked out and important information was exchanged, and the best pie in the county was available at almost any hour. It was at Clara's kitchen table, on an October afternoon in 1880, that Clara told Susan and Frank something she had been keeping for what she judged the right moment. She had, she said, been approached by a woman in San Antonio who was organizing a network of legal aid resources for families in disputed land situations across the territory, the same kind of situation as the Garcias, which was not unique but which remained largely unaddressed. The woman wanted to name Susan as a regional coordinator, which would involve some travel and a great deal of correspondence, but which would be an extension of the work Susan had already done, spread across a wider geography. "She's heard about the Garcia case," Clara said, "and about the documentation process you established at the county level. She thinks you could help a great deal of people." Susan sat with this for a moment. Frank sat beside her and said nothing, which was his way of making space. "What do you think?" Susan asked him. "I think," he said carefully, "that you have been thinking about this kind of thing for a while, even if you didn't have a name for it." She considered this. It was accurate. "The children," she said. "Thomas is 12 and entirely capable," Frank said. "Alina has me wound around her finger and always will, but I can manage. And my mother has been suggesting for 2 years that she would like to come to Texas and see her grandchildren." Susan looked at him. His mother, whom she had met twice, was a formidable practical woman from Kansas who would absolutely be an asset. "You talked to your mother about this," Susan said. "I may have written her a letter," Frank said, "about 6 months ago because I could see this coming and I wanted to be prepared." She stared at him. He held her gaze with the steadiness that had never in 7 years been anything but solid and true. "You are," she said, "the most remarkable person I have met in a long time." He recognized his own words and the corner of his mouth moved. "Are we agreed, then?" Clara asked, with the satisfaction of a woman who has been arranging the world's better outcomes for decades and finds the work rewarding. "We are agreed," Susan said. The work with the San Antonio network, which began in early 1881, was exactly what Clara had described, challenging and detailed and conducted largely by letter and occasional journey. And it made use of every skill Susan had, the organizational ability, the eye for documentation, the combination of patience and absolute refusal to accept unjust situations that had been her character since before she knew to call it that. Frank's mother, whose name was Anne, arrived from Kansas in April and was everything Frank had described, practical and warm and immediately indispensable, with a particular gift for managing Thomas's intellectual restlessness and Alina's social empire. She stayed 6 months the first year and returned the second, and on the third visit did not return to Kansas at all, having concluded, with the directness she shared with her son, that Texas suited her better. Anne Wells and Clara Marsh, 2 formidable women of similar generation and entirely different styles, became each other's most challenging companion and, eventually, most valued friend. The combination of them in the same household or the same meeting was an experience that few people who witnessed it ever forgot. The Cutter's Creek of 1883, 10 years after Susan Donnelly had stepped off the stagecoach into its dust, was a different town, though it was also, in the ways that mattered, the same. It had grown. It had schools and a telegraph and a newspaper and a county commissioner who had made its governance less arbitrary and more just. It had a successful cattle and horse operation that provided work for a dozen families. It had a store with a lending library that was, by now, the intellectual center of the community. It had families who had lived there for 20 years and families who had arrived last spring and were just beginning to learn its rhythms. It had the Garcia family, Eduardo and Maria and their children, and by now, the first of their grandchildren, living on land that was theirs and that was going to stay theirs. It had Frank and Susan Wells, in the house at the western edge of town, which had been added to twice, and was now a proper home with a long porch and a garden that Susan's mother would have recognized, and a shelf of books that ran the length of the main room, and a barn that Frank had built with Eduardo, and the ranch hands in which housed 4 horses, 3 of which were working horses, and one of which was a bay mare named Tuesday that was, technically, nobody's horse in particular, but which had elected to be Frank's. Thomas Wells, at 16, was reading everything he could find about engineering and had announced his intention to attend university in Austin, which both his parents had received with equal parts pride, and the small, quiet grief of parents who see their child preparing to leave toward something larger. Eleanor Wells, at 8, had organized the school's younger students into a theatrical performance for the town's founding anniversary celebration that had involved 15 children, 2 borrowed horses, a borrowed chicken, and a level of production design that caused Dr. Pierce to say he had seen more chaotic theatrical productions in Baltimore. And on an October evening in 1883, exactly 10 years and some months after Susan had arrived in Cutter's Creek with her $42 and her steady eyes and her improbable willingness to build something in unfamiliar ground, she and Frank sat on the porch of their house in the warm late evening, the children inside and the ranch quiet and the plains going to silver in the moonlight. They had been sitting in comfortable silence for 20 minutes, which was one of their best skills together. "Do you remember," Susan said, "what Clara said about you? That you were a man who had something taken from him and decided to be very quiet and very good at what he did and wait." "I remember," he said. "I think about that sometimes," she said. "What you were waiting for." He turned to look at her. The moonlight was doing something remarkable with the silver at his temples that had come in over the past few years and which she found, she had told him once, extremely distinguished, which he had received with exactly the amount of skepticism it deserved. "I think," he said, "that I was waiting to trust something again. A place, a purpose." He paused. "A person." She reached over and took his hand, which was a thing she had been doing for 10 years and which retained, through all of them, its full weight. "And did you find it?" she asked, though she knew the answer. She wanted to hear it. "All 3, he said, "right here." The moon moved through the Texas sky in the way it does, large and slow and entirely unhurried, and the plains stretched out in every direction with their ancient indifference to human affairs. And in the house behind them their son was reading by lamplight, and their daughter was asleep with her arms thrown wide, and their grandmother was mending a coat, and the stove was cooling, and the horses were quiet. And it was all of it, every piece, exactly what it was supposed to be. Susan Donnelly had come to Cutter's Creek with nothing except a battered trunk and the kind of quiet determination that makes men step aside or stare. She had found what she had not been looking for, which is how the best things are usually found. She had built a life from open ground, with her own hands and the hands of the person beside her, and the hands of a community that had made room for her the way communities do when they are lucky enough to understand their own need. And it was a good life, a real and full and ongoing life, and she intended to live every remaining inch of it with the same steady attention she had brought to all of it so far. Frank squeezed her hand once, the way he did when words were either unnecessary or insufficient, and she leaned her head against his shoulder, and the night settled around them like something that had been practicing for just this moment. In the morning there would be work, and decisions, and the next chapter of Thomas's argument for university, and a letter from San Antonio requiring her attention, and Eleanor's plans for some new project whose scope would become alarming by noon, and the ranch needing something, and the store needing something, and the county needing something. Because there was always something, and that was not a burden, but a fact about being alive in a place you have chosen and are woven into. But right now there was only this. The porch and the moonlight and the sound of the plains and the warm certain weight of his shoulder and the ring on her hand and all the years before them, unwritten and waiting. And she was, in this moment, completely and without reservation glad.